All right, guys, we are back. It is time for 7-point old school Singleton deck tech number 2. Okay, the focus of this particular deck tech is going to be on the deck that I actually constructed and played in the latest event. This is the one that was playing against the red-white deck I did the last deck tech for in the finals. And I've actually been playing the format for about 3 months. As I said before, this is probably, I would call it version 2.5 in that I actually built a blue-white deck before, but it was structurally quite different due to a points change that occurred kind of midway through testing when Ancestral Recall was removed to make room for a couple other cards because Brain Geyser was increased from 1 point to 2. And I couldn't run Brain Geyser plus Ancestral plus the other cards that I felt were necessary, and I had to make some choices, and I will go into detail about what those choices were as the deck tech unfolds. But I'm going to just jump right into it, start off in the left-hand corner as we move alphabetically through the cards, and talk about each one and why they're in here for those who have the patience for this sort of thing. All right, first card, Air Elemental, finally actually getting some play. And this is a kind of card that when people first started playing Magic way back in the early 1990s, 1993, 1994, it was obviously a very impressive beater. 5 mana for a 4/4 flyer in blue was pretty solid, but people were always sort of puzzled, bemused by the fact that Air Elemental just seemed to be a strictly worse version of Serra Angel, and begged the question of why you would ever actually play with Air Elemental over Serra, because the entire concept of running a monocolor deck was kind of unheard of at the time, and I kind of asked that same question myself, and I used to actually mock this creature. But of course, in the Singleton format, you have to be quite a bit more liberal in the card choices that you make, and the stat line of 4/4 flying for 5 mana is pretty damn solid. It's kind of interchangeable with the other 4/4 flyers for 5 in the format, and always very, very happy to cast this guy, and was actually a pretty nice finisher in a lot of the games. So definitely a solid man, clearly belongs in the deck. Next guy is Argivian Archaeologist, which is seeing actually a ton of play in the old school Singleton format, which is kind of wonderful given how cool this card is and how it never really was quite good enough to make the cut in a lot of lists back in the day, though it was in fact one of the primary chase rares in Antiquities. And in fact, I believe if you were to go back in time and look at price lists from 1994 when Antiquities first came out, and I think it came out in something like April or May of 1994, I remember buying 2 boxes of it actually at a local store, and it pretty much was an investment that required all the money I had at the time, and I opened those packs slowly and traded them away and stuff for the next year or so, which is kind of awesome. But Archaeologist was the primary chaser even before Candelabra of Tawnos and Mishra's Factory as well, because again, as powerful as Mishra's Factory is in modern day, it just was a couple years ahead of its time. There just wasn't that much to do with the card. But Archaeologist, everybody kind of immediately appreciated and respected. Obviously, there are lots of good artifacts. Being able to bring them back was amazing. And in fact, in the very, very first version of the deck, the very first version that was called that before it was retooled in the post-Mind Twist era with the 2 Scepter, 2 Serra moat version that kind of eventually propagated on the Usenet at the time. The very first version of the deck that ran 4 Mind Twists and 4 Mana Vaults and 4 Libraries of Alexandria found room for a lone Argivian Archaeologist. And my friend and I called it the little magic sub-game that you would sometimes get into, where if you got Archaeologist and your Chaos Orb, which was restricted, you could kind of have fun merrily flipping cards on your opponent's battlefield until they were demolished. So very cool to be able to play with this guy again, and he did a lot of work throughout the whole tournament. I was very, very happy to have him in the deck. Moving on, I've got Azure Drake here, which is a good creature occupying the 4 mana slot as far as both a threat and more as a blocker. It's got that magical 4 toughness. Azure Drake is actually good enough to show up in some old school lists, and I actually ran it. I think I ran maybe 2 copies of it back in my old Rock of Courageous Phantom Monster Felwar Jammed It home deck, and was pretty happy with it in there too. It blocks Serendipite. It survives all the 3-point damage burn. And it's actually, most importantly, as far as the way this deck played out, it's imminently castable. The fact that it's 3 generic and 1 blue is a really, really big deal, and in my opinion, makes it a strict upgrade over its brethren, the Ghost Ship from the Dark, which is basically the same stat line, but it costs 2 blue mana and 2 generic versus 1, and that is a night and day difference when your deck is frequently struggling to get double blue and double white in the same game. So while Ghost Ship is definitely a candidate for inclusion in this deck, I just think that Azure Drake is just a little bit better because it's so unlikely that you're going to be running the regeneration on Ghost Ship versus the being able to just run Azure Drake out on turn 3 or turn 4. And that makes it pretty good man to have in the deck, and I think an auto include. All right, moving on. The first point card so far in the list, Brain Geyser. This card is one of Blue's strongest weapons. Certainly in old school, we actually used to regard this card as one of the power cards. We actually referred to it as, I think, the 10th power card before Recall was printed. And yeah, I mean, I think there's probably like the power 11 at this point, and that would hurt, maybe power 12 actually, because that would include Soul Ring, Mana Drain, and Brain Geyser and Recall, as far as the cards that are just the backbone of the old constructed deck lists. But yeah, Brain Geyser, super powerful and potent. Love this card. It is incredibly decisive in so many games, and it's not just a way to draw massive amounts of cards and get miles ahead of your opponent, but you can also use it to close out a game that goes long. And I have won my fair share of games with just a big Brain Geyser late, or sometimes a Mana Drain fueled Brain Geyser. And in fact, I can recall some games that I played where literally my only way to win the game after my opponent gestures capped me for 2 Serra Angels and a Mirror Universe was a Brain Geyser that I would activate by basically casting a big Brain Geyser, mana draining my own Brain Geyser, time walking, untapping, recalling for Brain Geyser and time walk and mana drain, casting it again for more mana draining it, time walking, finally untapping and casting a huge lethal Brain Geyser for 40 or 50 cards. So you can do crazy shenanigans with the card. Obviously, even at around 5 mana, it becomes overwhelmingly strong. And later on in the game, being able to draw 5 or 6 or 7, just insane. And when you have this card in your hand early on in the game, you can kind of sculpt your entire game plan around it too. Just with the idea in mind that I'm just going to just survive, trade 1 for 1 with my opponent's cards as much as possible, and then I'm just going to Brain Geyser for 5 or 6 and just kind of put the game out of reach. So love to have the card in here. I think it is properly priced at 2, given other decks that are performing well in the format. And there has been some discussion of moving it to 3. I think that would be a little bit aggressive, but as I mentioned in the other video, there needs some shuffling in order, possibly. And maybe if the format changed a little bit, Brain Geyser would become overwhelmingly good and might have to be moved to 3, but I think it's good there. All right, the Chaos Orb. This card is pretty much an auto-include. That's an alpha, actually, which is kind of cool. Kind of an auto-include in pretty much every deck. Universal removal. There's no hexproof yet, so Chaos Orb pretty much kills everything. And in fact, based on the way that it's currently worded in old school, it probably would kill hexproof stuff anyway, since you sort of designate a target but don't actually target. It's sort of ambiguous, but super powerful card to have. And in conjunction with Recursion and the aforementioned Archaeologist, Chaos Orb is just about one of the best cards that you can draw in the game. It just gives you full security, and of course you can see it side by side there with Divine Offering. Never forget that your opponent can in fact respond by destroying your orb in response to activation, and can stop the effect from happening, and that will matter actually in the games that are coming up for commentary. Control Magic. This card, not woefully underplayed back in the day, honestly, and I tried to use it actually in the sideboard of early versions of my old school version of the deck when I started sort of taking my first steps into the format a few years ago. Found that it was just a little bit too slow and inconsistent to really merit inclusion. But in Singleton, this card is an absolute bomb. It is so powerful. The swing of being able, particularly because there's so few cards that remove enchantments. It isn't like everybody's playing with 4 disenchants. And being able to just steal kind of anything is such a huge shift in tempo that it can often just completely swing the game in your favor. And obviously late game, being able to steal a big threat, like a Triskelion that is cast, or a Mahamudi Jin, or a Serra, or a Shivan Dragon or something, you can really just win the game on the spot. It's such a giant tempo shift. And at the cost of 4 mana, it's just a supreme card. I love just the security of holding Control Magic while my opponent is kind of struggling to mount an offense. Just knowing that if they do in fact manage to stick a big threat, that I'm just going to take it and probably kill them with it. Love the card. All right, Copy Artifact. This card, another card that sort of sees some play in old school. I tried using it early on in my old school deck, and just found that it was a bit too inconsistent to warrant inclusion. And keep in mind, obviously, you're competing with a lot of really powerful stuff. It just was too hard to find room for it. I actually think Copy Artifact might even be at its absolute best in the format when you're using it to make a copy of Mishra's Factory, because it's being able to get 2 factories in play is so strong, and also accelerating your mana, kind of using it like a quasi-Felwar Stone. But it has incredible flexibility. Can allow you to make 2 copies of Chaos Orb, double up on an Icy Manipulator to really lock the board down, make a second Jam-Day Tome so that you can actually afford to have them destroy your Jam-Day Tome. Just amazingly flexible, and there are so many artifacts played in old school Singleton that you actually have reliable targets. I'm not a huge fan of this card in ordinary old school, primarily because most of the time you're going to be spending 2 mana to copy a Mox. Sometimes you're copying a Felwar Stone. But paying 2 mana to copy something that costs 0 that might make green or red mana or something, that's just not consistent and worthy enough, I think, for the slot. But I love the card in Singleton. It is phenomenal. All right, Counterspell. Anybody who's ever played Old School is very familiar with this card. I think the card is quite a bit actually overrated in regular Old School. I'm not really that big of a fan of it, primarily because there just aren't that many things you need to counter with a control deck that you can't answer in white. Counterspell gets a lot better when you're playing something like a blue-red tempo burn deck or something, because you just have fewer ways to interact with the type of permanents your opponent is playing. But I'd much rather like Plowshare or Disenchant something than have to worry about holding mana to counter it. And since the Old School format is so fast and tempo-based and just more aggressive, drawing counterspells when you're behind just feels terrible. It's much, much better to draw white cards. But in Old School Singleton, this is just an incredibly important tool to have at your disposal. In fact, having a counterspell really changes how you can approach a lot of the games you play, but you gotta be patient with it. That's the main key. You gotta view it as a one-shot effect that's kind of like a get-out-of-jail-free card, the kind of card that you play in order to save your life, literally, when your opponent is hurling an 8 damage disintegrate at your face or something late in the game. Countering something early that you might be able to deal with another way is, in my opinion, usually reckless and will probably lose you considerably more games than it will win you. Also, the same thing with using Counterspell to defend your permanents. It's something that I'll almost never ever do unless I'm completely required to do it in order to win the game. So for example, if I play a Jam Day Tome and my opponent has their Shatter or their Disenchant or something in hand, I'll probably counter it to defend it, just because Jam Day Tome is such an important asset. But as far as protecting almost anything else in the deck, like certainly any of the creatures, for example, I'm just gonna let the creature die. I'm not gonna counterspell removal unless literally that creature is the only thing keeping me in the game. So one of the things, and I've said this before, one of the things I really, really love about the Old School Singleton format is it really forces you to be thoughtful and conscientious about every answer that you play. And since Counterspell is kind of one of those ultimate answers, you just need to be really patient and make sure you're countering something that's worth it. All right, Disenchant, in that same category of amazing cards that sort of serve a very, very important purpose in the deck and are a one-of-a-kind tool that you cannot squander, Disenchant falls completely into that category. Same thing, it is such a precious thing to have in your hand. Don't just disenchant your opponent's Mishra's Factory or something early in the game. You will almost certainly regret it as the game goes underway. Having recursion of some sort, either regrowth or recall or time twister, can help with the use of Disenchant, but it's tremendous flexibility. It's really the only card outside of Chaos Orb and Tranquility that can interact with enchantments. And if you're playing a deck with white that loses to an enchantment, like say that thing over there, we'll talk about that later, do not disenchant something if you absolutely don't have to. And in fact, in my pod games, I had a couple of opponents that played Disenchant early. One match in particular that I'll get to when I'm doing commentary down the road, where my opponent played a Disenchant early that was extremely, extremely premature in my opinion, and ultimately cost him the game when I played a Steel Artifact on, I think, his Jam Day Tome. And he did not have the Disenchant to get rid of the enchantment, and the Jam Day Tome wound up killing him. So if you're playing Old School Singleton and you got Disenchant in your hand, clutch that thing like the most wealthy pearl necklace. Do not relinquish it unless you absolutely have to. All right. Disrupting Scepter. Oh my gosh. It feels so good to play with this card again. That is another alpha too. Pretty cool. Disrupting Scepter was one of the sort of chief cornerstones of the strategy that the deck used starting in mid-1994. And I would say, as far as iconic cards in that deck, Disrupting Scepter may have been the most iconic card. In fact, when I think back in the day, I think I probably signed more Scepters than any other card when people ask me to sign cards from their decks. And so there's some Scepters out there running around in the ecosystem with my signature on them still, I guess. But I mean, I can't say enough good things about it in this format. Disrupting Scepter, to me, feels so powerful that it almost feels like it should be an auto-include in nearly every single deck. And that means it goes in it would almost go in like a white weedy deck. It might be one of the few decks that you don't want to run it in, but anything mid-range, and certainly anything controller-oriented, be it black-white, be it blue-black or blue-red, white-blue, obviously, really any deck that has, and even mono-red decks, because they tend to be slow and kind of grindy, and certainly in mono-black, any deck that really is planning on playing a longer game, you want to run Disrupting Scepter. There's so few consistent artifact removal cards. The card will just completely crush your opponent because of all it making your opponent discard a card in a Singleton format is just ridiculous because of all the Singleton answers. You Scepter the guy and he's like, damn, I've only got, I've got a good creature in my hand and I've got my Fireball in my hand. Well, what do I discard? And if you make them discard the good creature, there isn't another copy of that creature in the deck. Same thing is true for a burn spell. Same thing is true for some enchantment kill. They might have an enchantment kill in their hand. They have to throw it away because you've got a Scepter out and they need to sort of mount some kind of offense. It just makes your opponent play such a difficult game and have to make such tough decisions. And then, of course, Scepter shines so well in the end game too, because as a control player, once your opponent's hand is reduced to 0, you have perfect information about what kind of threats you're looking at. Getting back to counterspells and stuff and the proper use of counters, good control players are very, very used to kind of auditing their opponent's hand size at all times, because the more cards your opponent has, the more potential threats they might be able to deploy in one turn. And when they play something that is potentially threatening, you're kind of faced with the decision of whether or not to respond to it or counter it. And it's really, really hard to know sometimes whether you should counter the card because the follow-up play might be much, much worse for you. So for example, your opponent goes to, let's say they go and they try to disenchant one of your good artifacts. And you're thinking, well, I kind of want the artifact in play. Maybe I ought to counter that. And then they follow up by casting Wheel of Fortune or Time Twister or Brain Geyser or something that just totally wrecks you. And with Scepter in play, and your opponent just top decking one card a turn, you have perfect information and you know exactly whether or not you should counter it because they are not going to have a follow-up play from their hand. And of course, the Scepter has the added benefit when combined with counterspells of making kind of an inevitable victory conclusion. If you've got a Serra Angel in play or a Mahamodi Jin and you've got a couple of counters in your hand and a Scepter, it's pretty much certain that they're drawing dead, particularly in a Singleton format. And you know this because you can just counter the next two plays even if they're perfect outs and close out the game from there. So just love this card. So fun to play with it again. I haven't had it in play in a long, long time. And it is truly at its best in 7-point old school Singleton. All right, Divine Offering. I talked about this in the other video. Just pretty much a mandatory inclusion in any deck with white. Having 2 instant speed abilities to kill artifacts is incredibly important. And the life gain ability of this card cannot be overstated. It was decisive in multiple games that I played throughout the event. Was incredibly decisive and important in the finals. And yeah, if you're running white, you're running Divine Offering. It's pretty much a no-brainer. All right, there's Felwar Stone, which is basically, in my opinion, the only acceleration, artifact-based acceleration that any deck should really be playing, outside of maybe some really weird, unusual, I don't know, maybe mono-red thing that wants to run Soul Ring. But Felwar Stone to me feels kind of like an auto-include in just about every deck, except for maybe a deck like the red-white deck that I faced in the finals. But pretty much any deck in the format's going to want to run Felwar, just so you have some kind of acceleration at all, because there just aren't enough good spells at 1 and 2 mana that you're going to be able to fill your entire deck with them and still have it work. You're going to be playing with things that cost 3 and 4 and 5, and probably things that cost 6 too. And a Felwar Stone that just makes really any color of mana, it's obviously better if it makes the mana that your deck wants to play with, but pretty much a Felwar Stone that makes any mana at all is excellent if you get it in your opening hand, and really can just help you tempo-wise. All right, Giant Tortoise. This little guy was discussed quite a bit actually in the commentary for the final stream, and he was kind of a late inclusion. He was definitely not in my older version of blue-white, and certainly not in the first version of the deck that I played. But damn, I was so happy with how this card performed. What's so funny is that in old school Singleton, a 1/4 stat line at 2 mana is an unbelievably tough to get through roadblock for most decks. The Tortoise is just, I mean, any sort of cheap deployment, and you notice the deck is actually really, really low on things that cost 2 and 1 in general. It just doesn't have a lot of, well, it doesn't have very many proactive 1 and 2 mana plays. It's got plenty of defensive 1 and 2 mana plays by nature of being blue and white. But as far as things that it can actually do that are meaningful on turn 2, it just doesn't have that many things to do. And Tortoise just feels like an awesome play against tons of decks. And against the really aggressive strategies like White Weenie, for example, or maybe mono green, green red, a Tortoise played early can mitigate so much damage. It's honestly, it's absurd. The card is just fantastic. I was super, super happy with it. And obviously it's pretty garbage against control decks, but even against those guys, sometimes you just play the Tortoise, you start chipping away at their life total, and before you know it, you've done 8 damage to them, and the whole way the game is played out is now affected by this little dork. So do not overlook the might of this Tortoise. He's a solid man, and I think absolutely has a rightful place in this blue-white deck. All right, Ice Manipulator. You can notice that funny that kooky border that is unique to the alpha version of the card. It looks so bizarre. I have no idea why it's so washed out. The beta, I think, is honestly way cooler, but this is the one that I found when I looked in my binder. Yeah, Icy Manipulator, I mean, anybody who's played with the card knows how good it is. It's particularly amazing in a format that is Singleton, that has a lot of pesky lands that you can't get rid of. So being able to tap your opponent's, say, Maze of Ith, or you can see right below an Island of Wak, being able to neutralize their biggest blocker or biggest attacker in a pinch, particularly against decks that have a fragile mana base that tends to run 3 colors. You can shut your opponent off of a color for a long period of time, sometimes for most of the game, and or you can keep people off of double colors. Remember, the format is filled with things that cost double blue and double white and double black, and being able to tap their second blue mana during their upkeep to prevent them from playing a 2 blue mana thing for sometimes a long period of time is amazing. And Ice can be copied, of course, to get 2 of them into play. Just such a flexible, powerful card. Can shut down your opponent's Winter Orb, or maybe their Howling Mine or something. Just does a lot. One small disadvantage of the card versus back in the era that I originally played, well, it wasn't called Old School then, it was just Type 1. Actually, it was just originally Magic and then Type 1. There were a bunch of static artifacts like Ankh of Mishra and Black Vice, and for a long time, the ruling on those cards was that if they were tapped, they didn't generate an effect. And that actually made Icy Manipulator quite a bit better against those threats, because you could actually tap down a Black Vice at the end of your opponent's turn and then untap and take no damage, since the artifact was tapped. But unfortunately, the card doesn't function that way anymore and is way more deadly. But that doesn't mean Icy isn't an auto-include in, I would say, pretty much every single old school Singleton deck should be running this card. It's just that good. Island of Wak. I believe it's pronounced that way. I think I pronounced it wrong in the other video. I actually had to look it up online. It's from Arabian Nights mythology, not surprising. And this card, honestly, completely overperformed my expectations. It was kind of a late include, mainly because the card Maze of Ith is a 1-point card, as I mentioned before. And Island of Wak shines so well, not just in conjunction with mode. Obviously, the 2 cards go together incredibly well. But the reason why the card is so insane is that it just makes your flyers impossible to deal with. Your opponent gets in a situation when you have Island of Wak in play where they can't just not attack you for damage. They can't block either. And so you never even you just win the game with the Island of Wak without ever having to tap. It's just in play the whole time. Your opponent can't block your Sarah because you just shrink their creature. And then they can't attack because your Sarah will just kill their guy and they'll use Island of Wak on it when they're coming in with it. And in both situations, that is crazy, insane value for a card that costs, no mana. I mean, it does obviously cost 1 slot. Just ridiculous. The one thing to consider and one important thing to notice, it's actually so funny. A lot of people probably don't know the text on this card. It says, tap to reduce target flying creature's power to 0. And it's so funny. I mean, I assume it was just a misprint or an oversight, but notice it's missing the important line of text that says until end of turn. And I think that there was probably a ruling about it by the time that I actually became at least aware of the card when I started playing, and that was in January of 1994. So maybe like a month or so after Arabian Nights came out. But there had to have been a period of time when people were looking at this card thinking, what the hell is this? You just tap it and their guy has 0 power forever? That's so ridiculous. Imagine trying to play against Island of Wak with a deck that had flyers in it. They just play the card and essentially just kill all of your flyers by tapping it. Pretty disgusting. Obviously, it only works until end of turn, but that is still supremely powerful. But one thing to keep in mind about it is that the current ruling is that it only reduces the creature's base power. So for example, if your opponent has a Dragon Whelp in play, which is a 2/3 flyer, if they attack you, you can use Island of Wak on it, reduce it down to a 0/3, and then they can pump it up afterward. Obviously, probably up to only 3/3, because to pump it bigger would mean that the Whelp explodes and dies. But still very important against a creature like a Shivan Dragon, for example, because Shivan Dragon, sure, they might have some extra mountains, but if they're playing multiple colors, they probably don't have a ton. And turning a Shivan into a 2/5 instead of a 7/5 is kind of a big deal and totally changes how you can interact with the card. You can now block it with, an Azure Drake, for example. So, but that is something to always consider. The Island of Wak does not fully stop pumpable creatures. All right, Jalem Tome. There was I believe Ken Fritz, who was doing commentary on the finals, had a really cool nickname for this card. He called it the Paperback. And unlike the proper Jamday Tome, the big book, the little book, which is sort of like a paperback, is, like 2/3 of the effect for half the cost. But the real, well, at least as far as activation, the casting cost is still 3. But Jalen Tome, woefully underplayed back in the day as well, and really shines in Singleton as a second source of card advantage. And yeah, it's card filtering, but in a Singleton format, being able to swap lands for spells is sort of effectively card advantage, because card quality just matters so much, and the timing of everything in an answers-based deck like this one, with a lot of singular answers, is just key. There were so many games that I was pretty much in a hopeless position, and was able to use Jalen Tome to sort of claw my way out and eventually gain control of the game and win from that position. And Jalen Tome, an instrumental part of that. The other thing too about the card is that everybody's played against JMD Tome a million times if they've played old school. Not a lot of people have played against Jalen Tome, and a lot of people I think who played against it don't really truly appreciate just how strong the card is, and will let you have it and keep it in play. In fact, I played multiple games where I had a Jalen Tome out, I drew probably 7 or 8 cards with it, and then when I played something like an Icy, my opponent had a Divine Offering ready for it and killed it instantly. And I was left sort of scratching my head, but it does make sense that I think people just don't play against the card a lot, and they just don't understand or don't recognize how powerful cycling really is. And it is an instrumental card in the deck, considering the mana base, which I'll get to later. But I'm running a total of 26 lands in this deck, along with the Felwar Stones, so 27 mana sources. And yeah, with that many mana and singular answers, you're going to be in a lot of games where if you don't have a way to draw cards or cycle cards, you're just going to get mana flooded and die. So very happy to have Jalen Tome. It was a phenomenal card in my deck. And again, it's a card I think should pretty much be an auto-include in nearly any strategy, because 2 mana cycle any card in your hand is great in almost anything, even a weenie deck, certainly in a burn deck, just excellent. All right, JMD Tome, the other cornerstone of control strategies. It actually wasn't that big of a fixture in my old deck. In fact, I only ran a single copy of the card because I was just playing a very slow and grindy mana drain attrition strategy with Scepters. But JMD Tome, probably the most defining card in all of modern old school control decks, and of course has a natural place in this deck. This is another card that should be in most lists. There's probably a few hyper fast decks that shouldn't be running it, but it is just so universally powerful. Card advantage is very hard to come by in old school, and JMD Tome does it better and at a fair cost than nearly anything in the format. There isn't really much more to say about the card. I think anybody who's versed in old school, and even people coming into the format, will be able to appreciate just how incredible JMD Tome is. It also gives you a sense of just how far card design and power creep has come over the years. I mean, compare JMD Tome with, I don't know, Jace the Mind Sculptor, and they made a 3-mana version of JMD Tome recently that costs 3 to cast and 3 to use, and no one's playing it. It's not in really any deck list except for maybe some cubes and stuff. So JMD Tome still has its heyday and its place in a format, and I think that's a wonderful thing. It is absolutely one of the best cards in old school 7-point Singleton. All right, land tax. Okay, so this is of all the cards in my deck, I think this is the only card that I played with that I was honestly unhappy with, and I feel that I probably made a mistake to include it. I talked before about just how amazingly strong the card was in the red-white weenie deck. But in this deck, not only did it underperform because I just never drew it, and of course it's just going to underperform by default, but the card is just not that good in my deck. And I really regretted actually allocating 2 points to it. And if I were to play in another old school, 7-point old school Singleton event, I would not run land tax for sure. I think even if they probably, maybe I'd run it if they reduced it to 1. But at a 2-point budget, in this deck, it just doesn't get the job done. And the problem is that, or the main thing is that I can't really do much for 2 mana. I just don't have that many things to play it to. I can play reactive cards, but I can't really play the land tax game, which means I'm deploying some kind of a threat, and then my opponent is forced into this uncomfortable situation where they have to either play extra lands to cope with the threat or develop their own game, or they have to let me land tax. And at that point, once you're land taxing, you can just pull all the lands out of your deck and draw nothing but gas. And I just can't really do that with my deck unless my opponent really cooperates. And most players are savvy enough to recognize that just letting me land tax with impunity is a bad deal. And so I'm the one who winds up having to play land, and then they just scoff at my 2-point card. So I really regretted playing with land tax. To say that it underperformed would be an understatement. The card was just totally mediocre. I kept drawing it by mid-game, and it was just worse than useless. I would have way more lands in play, and I would just stare at it in my hand, or I'd wind up throwing it away to a Jalen Tome, which isn't the worst thing in the world, maybe discarding it to recall. But I think I said this before, I played a total of, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 games in the entire event. And in those 16 games, wait, is that right? 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, plus 9. Yeah, no, it was more than that. It's like 20 games. Anyway, I'm not sure the exact number, but I played a gazillion games and I activated land tax in one of those games. One game out of the entire tournament was a game where I was actually able to land tax multiple times. And that's only because my opponent just ignored it and kind of cooperated and let me pull lands out of my deck. And of course I won that game quite easily, but overall the card was just bad. And I don't think it belongs, at least in this archetype. All right, moving on. Mahamoti Jin. The first big rare that I ever saw when I first saw packs of Unlimited Edition open way back in January of 1994. Mahamoti Jin was ridiculous. My friend got it. I was so jealous of it because it was so big. And all I got was a crummy Royal Assassin. And anyway, of course, as I learned the game, I realized that Mahamoti wasn't all that great. Although I did run it in that first version of the deck, the 4 Mind Twist, 4 Library, 4 Mana Vault version. Of course, any creature would have pretty much worked in that format. But Mahamoti absolutely shines in this deck. It is such a strong, supreme finisher. It's pretty much bigger than all the removal in the format except for the X spells, Swords, Plowshares, Terror, and things like, well, Chaos Orb, obviously, and maybe Fissure. But its ability to just dominate all the other flyers in the game is superlative. Just being able to put them out there, know that you've just got the game shored up, that they're going to just struggle and go through contortions trying to deal with a 5-6, and it closes out the game incredibly fast. Just in 4 hits, closing out a game of Old School Singleton is phenomenal. So, love the Mahamoti Jin. Can't really say enough things about it. It should pretty much be in any deck running blue in the format, I think. Mana Drain. All right, I went crazy and talked about this card for like 10 minutes in my points assessment video, so I'm not going to talk about it too much. It is a 1-point inclusion. It is an auto-include. It is one of the best blue cards ever created in Magic. It's certainly part of the Power 11 or Power 12. It is so insane to draw in pretty much any deck early in the game, and even with mana burn in the format, it is still just utterly ridiculous. And keep in mind that 7-point Old School Singleton does in fact have mana burn. So occasionally you do have to mana burn when you cast Mana Drain. That is a tiny price to pay for the raw power, the raw reactive and proactive power that Mana Drain gives you. I mean, it allows you to just basically be insanely proactive with a control deck to punish your opponent for trying to literally play anything. And this card was the backbone of the control strategy in what was originally Magic and then Type 1 and then later Vintage for more than a decade. And still has a place in contemporary Magic. Obviously, is an insane card in Commander, and they keep reprinting it too. There's a famous statement made by Mark Rosewater, I think around maybe like 1996, something like that, maybe 97, where Mark said that people were asking about whether or not they'd ever reprint Mana Drain because the card was an uncommon in Legends, and the price just kept going up and up and up. And people said, "Man, when are you guys going to reprint Mana Drain? It's not on the reserve list. You should reprint it." And Rosewater famously said that they would reprint Mana Drain when R&D, research and development at Wizards, got hit by a bus. Funny to look back on history and think about that. But obviously the card's been reprinted a ton of times now. It is a blue staple in Commander and is even stronger in this format. Absolutely love the card. So good. All right, Moat. Another card that I was just so happy to be able to utilize. It's another 1-point card. So you've seen that I think I've actually covered. This might actually be my last pointed card. Yeah, 2 for Brain Geyser, 2 for Land Tax, 1 for Mana Drain, 1 for Moat. Oh no, we're at 6 points now. Wow, Moat is so good in 7-point Old School Singleton. I think a very, very underplayed card. I hadn't really seen it in even blue-white and control lists very much. People were playing it in things like Naya, red, white, green, artifact, enchantment-based control decks, and black-white control decks as well. But I think the card is just at its absolute best in a blue-white control deck where you have the ability to protect it. That's the key. And in fact, Moat is just so overwhelmingly strong that you can literally sculpt your entire game plan around it. There were numerous games that I played throughout the event where I had access to Moat early on in the game, and I knew that just based on the range of what my opponent could be holding, all I had to do was survive to a point where I could deploy the Moat and protect it with either a Disenchant or Divine Offering against a Chaos Orb, if that was their answer, or a Counterspell or a Spell Blast or something, if their answer was a Tranquility or a Disenchant or an Orb. And I knew that if I had those 2 cards, I could just win the game on the spot for 6 mana or whatever we require to do both of those things. And that's pretty ridiculous for a card that costs only 1 point. Now, obviously, it does require you to play with a critical mass of flyers, but if you're playing a blue-white control deck, you're probably just planning to win with flyers anyway. and Moat just kind of does everything you want. I ran 2 of them in the old version of the deck back in 1994 and forward, along with the 2 Sarahs and a Mirror Universe to finish. And Moat shut down, well, probably literally thousands of opponents, and until it was eventually made a little bit obsolete by the rise of Mishra's Factory in the Abyss, it was, in my opinion, kind of an auto-include in any type of control strategy. It is one of the absolute best cards in this deck, and if you do plan on playing 7-point old school Singleton and being serious about it, you should definitely pick one up. I think that the Italian Legends version of this card is still pretty affordable. The Legends version is around $1,000 now, which is pretty much in line with all the best rares in Legends, the reserve list rares. Love Moat. Old Man of the Sea. Oh my gosh. Okay, so I want to talk about him a little bit. I know this video is already getting a little long, but there's just so much history here. The very, very first deck that I think that I built, actually, once I moved away from my mono black deck, my gigantic 200 card mono black deck when I first started learning the game, was a deck actually based around Old Man of the Sea, and it ran 4 copies of Old Man, 4 copies of the card Blessing, and 4 copies of the card Diamond Valley. And I would play the Old Man of the Sea, I would put Blessing on him, and I would pump up his power, steal their best guy, and then immediately sacrifice it to the Diamond Valley. And man, when people didn't have access to Strip Mine yet, and yeah, I think at the time Old Man of the Sea was the only thing in play. Or I'm sorry, was the only set. So Arabian Nights was the only set that had been printed. This was pre-Antiquities. So there were no Strip Mines, and nobody could kill the Diamond Valley. And once the Old Man of the Sea got Blessing on him, well, it was pretty hard to kill him too, because you could just pump his health up. So they couldn't kill him with red spells, which meant that they had just Plowshares or maybe Terror to kill him, and no one really played with Swords of Plowshares back then. Maybe there was a few Terrors running around, but it was pretty much like a hard lock on any creature-based opponent strategy, and it was amazing. And then eventually, of course, everybody sort of learned to play Magic a little better, including me, and I retired my 4 Old Men of the Sea to my binder. And eventually, I think, wound up selling and trading all of them off, and actually had to acquire a couple of them more recently to play Singleton formats. But I was so thrilled to actually have an Old Man of the Sea to use in my deck. God, this guy's so good in 7-point old school Singleton. I think if you're going to play blue in the format, you've got to pick up 1 copy of this creature. It's just insane. I don't know how many of you guys have played Commander. Certainly my regular viewers who watch my Commander videos have certainly played plenty of Commander probably, and know the power of the card Vidalcan Shackles, which is kind of a cornerstone and a feature in all of my blue-based control decks when I play the Commander format. And Old Man of the Sea in this format sort of replicates that effect. Just the ability to steal a creature to prevent your opponent from ever attacking you. It's just a problem that has to be answered. It has to be solved. And when you're running blue counterspells and recursion, you can often just keep the Old Man in play. If you are able to determine that your opponent can't realistically get a foothold in the game or win if you have an Old Man of the Sea in play, then by all means protect the creature, and you can probably just stop everything that they're going to do forever, in the same way that Moat stops all the ground creatures. And Old Man is a 2/3, so it can block and it can attack. It's just a sick card, honestly. It's so strong, and it was extremely fun to just bring multiple decks to their knees, stealing Birds of Paradise, stealing Llanowar Elves, stealing Hypnotic Specters, just kind of does everything. And for 3 mana, it even has a good stat line for creatures of this era. I mean, the Hurloon Minotaur is a 2/3 for 3 mana also. Only problem with Old Man, of course, is that it costs double blue, but that kind of power in a 3-drop is just pretty much unparalleled in the format. Love it. All right, Power Sync. Moving on to kind of the weenie counterspells. This one is, people play Power Sync in old school. I am not a fan of this card in general. I think that being in a situation, because most of the stuff that you actually really want to counter in old school and regular old school doesn't cost very much mana. Most of the cards you really want to counter are things like removal on your Jam-Day Tome, things like Disenchants and stuff, or cards like Ancestral Recall or Demonic Tutor or Time Twister and Wheel of Fortune and stuff. And because so many of the good cards in the format, Soul Ring too, so many of the cards in the format are extremely cheap and efficient, having to keep a ton of mana on tap with Power Sync just kind of sucks. And sure, it's great when you counter something that's big, like a big X spell, like a Brain Geyser or a Mind Twist or something like that. But with the exception of a small range of X spells, there just isn't that much that blue-white wants to counter that you can't just answer with white already. And having to keep a ton of mana untapped to deal with a relatively small threat really just is terrible. That's not really what I think counterspells are good for. And it does have the one added benefit of actually forcing your opponent to tap out if they are not able to answer if they're not able to pay the extra mana. And even if they are, of course, they do have to tap out anyway. So you can use Power Sync to set up plays, and that can sometimes matter, particularly in a control versus control mirror. But the control mirror is not really happening that much in old school Singleton. And so Power Sync is kind of just, bottom of the barrel type counterspell, where you're using it, hoping to get an opportunity to counter something big with it. But unlike Counterspell and Mana Drain, I don't think that you want to use Power Sync that judiciously, unless you're, of course, playing against an opponent who's packing a lot of red X spells and your life total is under threat. In that case, obviously, Power Sync might be a lifeline, and you should clutch it as well. But in most circumstances, I think just use Power Sync on kind of anything that they might play, because you never know when the next opportunity to actually counter something might come up. Preacher Man. Talked a bunch about this guy in the red-white deck tech. He is a super powerhouse, just in the same way as Old Man of the Sea. I would say that Old Man is probably actually a little stronger, even though Preacher, of course, can take any creature. And the reason is because Old Man of the Sea has 3 health and Preacher only has 1. So this guy's vulnerable to just a lot more removal. You play him early, he dies to like an Acacian Javelineer or an Aelopow or something. Just not as robust of a creature. Obviously, Old Man dies to Bolt and Chain Lightning and Sword Splashers, but of course, most creatures do that are not big, tough finishers. But if you get Preacher in play, it's the same thing as the Vidalcan Shackles problem. Your opponent just cannot mount any type of offense through it. And since all this deck is really trying to do is stall the game out, you can just play a Preacher, and if they can't answer it right away, it's going to be nearly impossible for them to kill you with creatures. And that is an amazing, amazing value for 3 mana. Preacher was really woefully underplayed back in the day, didn't really see much inclusion in any decks. And so 7.0 old school Singleton has really given him some opportunity to shine. All right, the final 1-point card, Recall. So part of the Power 12. I love Recall. It was a sort of late inclusion. I actually didn't have it in the Ancestral Recall Brain Geyser version of this deck because I just didn't have the budget for that. I was running Mana Drain, Moat, Ancestral at 4, Brain Geyser at 1 as my 7 points. And when Ancestral was removed from the deck, it freed up a ton of points. And Recall immediately came into the deck, and I've been incredibly, incredibly impressed by it, and really think I was foolish for not using it in the first place. As I said before, in a Singleton format where you have singular answers to everything, being able to get them back, and sometimes getting back multiple perfect answers from your graveyard, and incredibly important tools like Counterspell, Mana Drain, Moat, Scepter, Geyser, just being able to exchange lands for those cards in the mid to late game is ridiculous. And also, its overall impact on your game plan is tremendous, because you can just let your opponent kill your stuff, knowing that you have a Recall in your deck, and unless it's right at the bottom of your deck, you will reach a point in the game likely where you just recall for 3 or 4 things that are all insanely powerful and decisive, and almost win the game on the spot. That's crazy value for 1 point of point allowance, and again, is another card I think that should pretty much go in any blue list based on the way the format plays out. Just love Recall, and did tons of work for me in the event. Spirit Link. This card, I criticized its inclusion in the red-white deck that my opponent played. I think Spirit Link is a monstrous powerhouse in this deck. It is so good. 1 white mana to answer really any damage-based threat. It obviously doesn't answer passive creatures like Preacher, Old Man, Argivian Archaeologist. It sucks to play it on Hypnotic Spectre. You shouldn't do that. But answering any other type of big beater with 1 white mana is phenomenal. And when you play it on something like your opponent's Serendipite, for example, you're going to be gaining 1 life point per turn off their guy. Now, there's obviously one caveat to Spirit Link because of the way that rules templating works nowadays. This wasn't always the case. But if you ever get down to 0 life or negative life, at any point you will die and lose the game, even if you have life gain that would bring you back over 0 on the stack. So playing a last-ditch effort to Spirit Link, like, a 5/5 when you're at 2 is not going to save you, unfortunately. However, in most situations, you're able to link up one of their creatures and pretty much make it obsolete until they're either able to remove the Spirit Link or they use the creature to block something, perhaps, or it dies to a Wrath of God or whatever. And of course, Spirit Link has the extra benefit of doing what I think it was probably mostly intended for, which is linking up one of your creatures and letting you gain life off the lifelink ability, which can be unbelievably decisive against decks that are trying to kill you with burn. And there were so many games where I got down to precariously low life totals, particularly when I was testing against red-white, where I would just Spirit Link my guy, and in a few turns, I was out of range of everything. 1 white mana to effectively win the game in the mid-game and just ignore all their burn is just crazy. So love the card. Definitely an auto-include in any deck with white that isn't trying to just beat the opponent down quickly. Steel Artifact. since you're running blue-white, you just kind of can't have enough artifact kills since you're planning on playing a long, grindy game. And I opted not to play with the card Dust to Dust. Dust to Dust is very powerful, but it has the problem of requiring 2 targets and 2 white mana. And it feels really, really terrible to have to kill, I don't know, your opponent's Juggernaut that's killing you with a Dust to Dust and simultaneously kill your own Jalem Tome so you don't die. And to me, that makes the card unattractive enough to not include it. I mean, I guess maybe if the format were to become more control-oriented and more people were playing heavy control decks with tons of artifacts, Dust to Dust would probably warrant main deck inclusion. But for now, I think the card does not belong in the deck. But Steal Artifact is excellent because it's a singular answer, and Theft is just so much better than Destruction. Now, of course, that's not always true. There are cases where you would much, much rather have the ability to actually kill the artifact, like your opponent has a Black Vice out on you or something, and stealing it won't do anything because Black Vice targets a person when it comes into play. And same thing is true for cards like Winter Orb and Howling Mine and Anka Mishra. But there are enough cards that are theft worthy. Certainly all the big artifact creatures, Juggernaut, Suchi, Triskelion, Tetravis, even things like Clockwork Beast or Clockwork Avian. There's just, and even Jade Statue, and of course Icy, which is in every deck, and Tome and Scepter, and sometimes even Chaos Orb too. Steal Artifact just shines against so many different decks in the format. A very, very powerful effect that can sometimes just win you the game on the spot. Swords to Plowshares, just like Lightning Bolt in the other deck tech video, I don't think there's really anything I need to say about this card. We all know how good it is. Best white removal ever printed. Wrath of God. Yet another reason to be attracted to the color white in this format. It's funny how white as a color, back in Alpha, if you look at it from the perspective of limited cards, if you're playing a limited format like a draft format, white is miserable, awful, by far the worst color and a complete trap. If you ever get to participate in a draft using unlimited beta or alpha, do not draft white. White is terrible, it is a trap, no matter what. Even if you get a Wrath of God and a Sarah, just forget it. Don't pick white, you're gonna wind up with a bunch of 1/1 garbage creatures and a bunch of weird enchantments that don't do anything, and you're gonna hate your deck. So fortunately we're playing 7.0 school Singleton, and we get to choose all the best of that white has to offer. And white is in fact, in my opinion, the second strongest color in old school. I mean, it just kind of answers everything. It has incredibly efficient removal. It has cards like Moat, it has great flyers, it's just awesome. And Wrath of God, phenomenal in this deck. So powerful and impactful to have it in your opening hand because you can just sculpt the whole game around it. And it is particularly amazing with cards like Islander Wak Wak and some of the other kind of gum up the board cards like Wall of Swords and the Azure Drake and stuff, where you basically force your opponent to just heavily overextend, get a lot of things in play, thinking that they're gonna somehow just start alpha striking you and killing you. And then you cast Wrath of God and you get like, 2 for 5 against them or something, you just win the game on the spot. Such a great card. And an ever-looming threat that you do have to play it carefully because the effect is a one-shot and it's so powerful, but it can really just totally win you the game on the spot as well, getting massive card advantage on board. The Serra Angel, haha, there she is. Of course, this was an inevitable card to include. It was the primary finisher in the early versions of the deck until I think Morphling came along in Urza Saga in 1999. But for 5 years, the Serra Angel reigns supreme as the best finisher for old school, well, they weren't old school control decks. For Type 1 control decks, I ran 2 of them, used them to batter people down. The vigilance, such a huge factor. The fact that the Serra Angel can attack and block at the same time. And people would experiment with other finishers for a while. They ran things like Mahamudi Jin, they would run Millstone to try to win the game. Some people would run artifact creatures. But Serra's vigilance just kind of put it over the top because it allowed you to both block, which was kind of your primary game plan anyway, since you're playing a control deck, while simultaneously punching your opponent in the face for 4 or even 8 a turn. And I don't know how many opponents I killed with Serras over the years, but it had to be probably in the, I don't know, at least mid 4 digits. Lots and lots of people love Serra Angel, love the fact that it has such a perfect place in this deck. It is definitely one of the most potent finishers ever printed, at least until it was rendered obsolete by all the crazy power creep in the game nowadays. But very, very fun also to just sort of revisit 7.0 school Singleton format, play with the Serra Angel, and really just remember why I love this creature so much and why it was so feared. All right, nearing the end of the list here. We're up at the deep into the S's. Spell Blast. So in my original version of this deck, I was actually running a copy of Flash Counter over Spell Blast, and I kept running into situations where I was just holding on to Flash Counter, just begging them to play something that I could counter, and I'd get all this mana in play, and my opponent would just be playing creature after creature, and they'd play like a big sorcery or something, and I'd just go, God damn it, why do I have this dumb card in my deck? It just doesn't do anything. So in version 2.5, I replaced Flash Counter with Spell Blast, It's obviously totally mediocre as a counterspell. It's literally antithetical to what counterspells are supposed to do, which is allow you to answer a threat with something that's more efficient and cheaper than the threat itself. So by definition, Spell Blast is going to always cost more than the thing that you're countering with it. But that said, there's a lot of 1 and 2 mana spells that are kind of defining in the format. And being able to stop a Chaos Orb for 3 mana, or a Disenchant for 3 mana, or maybe a Time Twister Wheel of Fortune for 4, super, super powerful. It's very, very good to stop Plowshares and the various bolts and stuff. And mid to late game, because you run such a big mana base, you can stop even big X spells with this. I mean, it's not the best thing in the world, but again, you know, beggars can't be choosers. You kind of have to work with what you're given. And Spell Blast does enough work and answers enough threats in the format that I think it belongs in the deck, and I was actually quite happy with it. Serendipite. A little bit strange to see a Serendip in a control deck, but you just can't argue with the stat line. Anybody who's played Old School is very, very familiar with this creature. It's probably, with the exception of Mishra's Factory, and you could make an argument for Atog, it's probably the best creature in Old School, and it's certainly amazing in this deck. If you're able to draw Serendip early and play it, depending on how the game is going, you can start attacking, although most of the time when I'm playing Serendipite, it's just kind of hanging around and hitting me for a point a turn, while my opponent struggles to deal with its stats. 3/4 flying for 3, just so strong, and can often mitigate dozens of damage just by itself, while allowing you to deploy the more powerful defensive cards in the deck and prevent your opponent from killing you. And certainly you can Spirit Link it and mitigate all the damage. And once you start to play other things, you know, some of the other defensive cards, like, you know, the turtle or something, you can start attacking them for 3 in the air and close out the game really, really quickly. Serendip is just all-around powerhouse. Again, I think an auto-include in any deck with blue in the format. And Wall of Swords. Look at that. A wall in a Tier 1 constructed deck in this format. Old School Singleton, 7-point Old School Singleton is an awesome format because things like walls are extremely competitive and good. I didn't have Wall of Swords in my early version of the deck, and every time I played this card against pretty much every opponent, I was happy with it. Even against the control decks, I was happy with it. And against the aggro decks, it is a gigantic brick wall. They're just not attacking into it. And there's a bunch of other walls in the format. I've seen people use things like Living Wall, for example, and of course there's the Wall of Fire, the Wall of Water. There's tons of walls in Legends, millions of them. But what's really critical in a wall is that the wall has power. It's really, really, I mean, obviously you want toughness too, but a wall's got to have power, in my opinion, to really actually impact the game. Because otherwise, even if you have a zero power wall in play, your opponent can just kind of attack you with all their stuff. And yeah, you're stopping some of the damage, but you're still taking damage. And in a control deck, taking damage every turn is not, I don't know, it's not analogous to really winning. You're just taking damage every turn. Eventually you're going to die. You're going to have to answer those creatures anyway. At least with Wall of Swords in play, unless the creatures have 4 health, you're going to be killing something every turn when they try to attack. That's amazing value. The stats are huge for 4 mana, at least in this era. And it kind of blocks almost everything in the format. If you think about all the 4/4 flyers, it blocks Serendip, it trades with Juggernaut, it blocks Su-Chi, it blocks Urnam Jin. It doesn't block the Juzam, which is unfortunate. It doesn't block the Shivan, doesn't block Mahamoti, but if you have another flyer in play, you can actually use the double blocking to take down something even bigger. Love the card, so happy to include it, and would absolutely run it in any type of defensive white deck with white. Sonic Blast, another just amazing staple in blue. This deck shows up in tons and tons of blue-red and ATOG-based decks in Old School. It is incredibly cheap and efficient removal. It does the magical 4 points of damage at instant speed. There really isn't anything not to love about the card. Sure, it does deal 2 to you, but considering you're often blowing up something that would hit you for at least 4 damage a turn, Psyblast is awesome. And having a little bit of reach in the deck is great. There are numerous games where my opponent kind of just got themselves down to 4, either through Sylvan Library, through City of Brass damage, through taking hits from my guys, from Serendipite or multiple Serendipites in one case. And having Psyblast in your hand means that you only need to get them down to 16. You don't have to worry about those last 4 points. You can just close it out right away. So, of course, I think, again, Psyblast is another card that if you're playing blue in 7-point Old School Singleton, you should be running it. Whew. All right, guys, that was 54 minutes of talking about all the cards. I'm just going to go over the lands here fairly quickly so this video doesn't go longer than an hour. City of Brass, a painful Tundra, but because this deck is so hungry for double blue and double white, you really can't run enough Tundra equivalents other than Rainbow Veil, which I wouldn't use because Rainbow Veil is terrible. But City of Brass, sure, it's point of damage every turn, but the flexibility of being able to get both your colors as early as turn 1 is critical and one of the best lands in the deck. I'm running a total of 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 basic islands. the single copy of Mishra's Factory, of course, obligatory, probably best creature in Old School. I mean, arguably the best land in Old School outside of Library of Alexandria. Just a ridiculous card in pretty much any format, way stronger than it should be due to the fact that tapped creatures can deal damage. If you're able to copy it with Copy Artifact over there, it's even better, but kind of an auto-include in pretty much every Old School Singleton deck as well. And I think I have 7 basic planes, and the strip mine, and then I have just a gamut of dual lands. You notice I'm running every dual land that makes blue or white mana. So that includes Scrubland, Tropical Island, Tundra, Underground Sea, Plateau, Savannah, and Volcanic Island. A number of people who actually saw my deck list were puzzled by the fact that I did run all the dual lands. They're thinking, well, your deck is only blue-white. You don't have any spells at all that are not blue or white. Why open yourself up to things like Blood Moon, for example, if you're not going to be utilizing those colors? And the truth of the matter is that, first of all, Blood Moon is pretty underplayed in the format. There aren't a lot of decks really running it because most decks tend to run just mostly basic lands. And while Blood Moon, I think, does have a place because it can shut down cards like Factory, Island of Whack Whack, Maze of Ith, possibly Library of Alexandria, maybe Diamond Valley. I mean, it does sort of muck around with your opponent's special lands, but the notion of using Blood Moon the way you do in Old School, where you just play Blood Moon and your opponent just can't cast spells for the rest of the game, that doesn't really happen in this format because there just aren't enough dual lands to make it worth it. And so, in my opinion, running these dual lands doesn't really cost me anything. And the benefit is actually, it's not insignificant. There have been multiple games, because Theft is such a big part of this deck's game plan. I've got Preacher, Old Man of the Sea, Control Magic, Steel Artifact. Because Theft is such a big part of my game plan, there actually are many, many games where I'm able to activate something that they have, that I stole from them because of the fact that I have dual lands. And another very, very frequently played creature in the format is called the If Biff Ifrit from Arabian Nights. It's a 3/3 flyer for 2 green and 2 generic, and either player can pay 1 green mana to do a 1 damage hurricane effect. So it hits both players and all creatures. And there was, I remember a game that I played where I had, it actually wasn't in this event, it was in the first event, but I had a Felwar Stone and a Tropical Island in play. And because the guy had If Biff Ifrit in play, and because I had a Tropical Island, he was unable to use his If Biff Ifrit at all to deal damage to me, besides hitting me in the face for 3 every turn, which eventually I think actually eventually won in the game. But it did buy me a lot of extra turns where I wasn't taking 4 extra damage a turn, which is what he would have been able to do. He would have been able to deal 2 to me at the end of my turn and 2 at the end of his turn over and over and over again, and just sped up the clock massively and killed me with it. And because I had 2 green sources, he couldn't use the extra ability on the If Biff Ifrit at all, because then I would just pay 2 mana and kill his own creature. So that was one example. I've stolen Brothers of Fire and been able to use their ability. I've stolen plenty of Dragon Whelps and Shivan Dragons and been able to pump them. Stole Scavenger Folk and used its ability. There's enough creatures in the format that you can piggyback on your dual lands to activate their abilities, that I think it's worth it. You know, maybe you could regenerate a Will-O-Wisp. You can steal a Sedge Troll and regenerate it and give it +1/+1. There's tons and tons of different options, and because it costs so little to run these dual lands, other than obviously the budgetary cost associated with acquiring them, it is a no-brainer inclusion in my opinion. So that is all 60 cards of my deck from the event. I've got a bunch of commentary videos coming up for not only the games in the final match, but also some games I played in the preliminary rounds and in the top 8 as well. I'm going to cover one more thing, which is the 3 cards that I think I would change potentially. If you remember back 6 hours ago, I talked about land tax and about how it was a mistake to run this card, that it was 2 points, and it was obviously a mistake to run. So if I were to build this deck again and play it in another event, I would definitely, I think, run these 2 cards right here to replace it. I run Mana Vault, which I talked about at length in my other video. I think that the deck is so lacking proactive and early drops that just running the Mana Vault and being able to ramp out something fast like a Moat or a Mahamudi Jinn or Sarah or an Air Elemental, it has a lot of big things. Also can fuel a Power Sink or a Brain Geyser late or a Recall. That's just really, really awesome value for 1 mana. And I might actually trim a land out of the deck. I felt like it was a little land heavy anyway to make room for Mana Vault, as I'm removing 1 card and have to add 2. And then the other card would be the Maze of Ith. Maze of Ith I'm not a huge fan of, but in a purely defensive deck where winning the game is sort of incidental once you've established control, nullifying one of your opponent's best attackers over and over and over again is a pretty big deal. The card does cost a point, so it doesn't show up in every single deck list, but I think it is conducive enough to what the deck is trying to achieve that it's probably a pretty good card to run. And I think collectively these 2 cards would probably result in a lot more happiness for the player of this deck than that singular land tax, which just really underperformed throughout the whole event. And then the final card that I've been considering and wish I could find room for is Wall of Air. I talked already about how incredibly strong the Wall of Swords performed, and Wall of Air is kind of akin to the Wall of Swords almost. Obviously it's missing 2 points of power, but it's got 5 health and it only costs 3 mana. This is like an impenetrable roadblock early in the game for nearly any type of aggressive strategy. The only problem, of course, is that pesky double blue. And having played my deck probably 100 games now, at least through all the testing I've done, there's just a lot of games where you don't have double blue for a while. And if you're relying on a 3-drop to shore up the ground while you get your other stuff online, and if the 3-drop costs double blue, it's not like Old Man of the Sea. You know, Old Man of the Sea, of course, costs double blue as well, but Old Man of the Sea is so powerful and can really impact the game kind of at any stage of the game as well, versus the Wall of Air, which is really only at its best on turn 3, maybe turn 4. You can kind of feel good hanging out behind it, but I feel like once you move to the mid-game, the Wall of Air becomes kind of a bad draw, unless you're already really, really far behind. It doesn't have the ability to just completely lock up the game the way the Old Man of the Sea does, because it only has 1 power. And if your opponent's got a couple of creatures in play, or a Bander, or some 2 health flyers, whatever the case might be, they're just going to ignore the Wall of Air and continue to deal damage to you. And as I mentioned before, that's not a winning spot. So I'm not really sure if this card belongs. If I were to put it in, it would be tough to find room for it. Maybe the candidates would be something like the giant Tortoise, as much as I like him. I don't know. I'd be curious to hear other people's opinions about it. But I think that land tax should definitely come out, and Mana Vault and Maze of Ith would come into the deck, and probably I'd remove 1 island. But that is a story for another day. Again, there's the deck. Hope you guys all enjoyed this commentary video. I hope it wasn't too long. I talked for an entire hour about a lot of cards in 7 Old School Singleton. But the good news is the next videos will be the good stuff. I'm going to start with, it's going to be a total of 4 initial videos that are going to cover the games in the finals. And then I'm going to go and cover the games, provided that there's interest, and hopefully the feedback is positive. I will go and cover some of the games also from the top 8, and then some of the games that I played in the pod as well. Please leave some comments if you enjoyed this whole video. I always enjoy reading what people have to say and reading people's thoughts. And thanks for watching. See you guys soon.